Hi everyone, my name is Elisabeth Whyte, and today we're going to be talking about how forgetting is frustrating, diving into the topic of learning and memory in video games. So, a little bit about me. My name is Elisabeth Whyte. I'm a white female with long brown hair, green eyes, and I wear glasses. I got my PhD in developmental psychology from Penn State. When I was at Penn State, my research focused on how kids learned language and social skills. I currently work on the Bethesda user research team, which is now part of Xbox Research. Today we're going to talk a lot about a memory concept called cognitive load. We can think about this cognitive load as the amount of mental processing power needed to learn and play a video game. This is all related to various types of memory systems, and we won't go too deep into the science behind memory processes, though I'm happy to geek out about brain sciences all day. We can roughly think about this in terms of a computer analogy and ask how much RAM does this game require from our brains? And are our brains capable of processing the amount of information this game is requiring? On the screen is a picture of a random part of a computer just for illustration of thinking about the brain like a computer in this talk. Games are often having to optimize for the hardware they run on, but we should also be thinking about the same types of limitations with our players' brains. On the screen is a version of a classic flow theory diagram with ability level on one axis and challenge level on the other. Flow theory talks about an optimal level of engagement where the player's ability level matches the challenge level of the game, represented by the middle area on the graph. The other quadrants are labeled boredom and frustration. We're going to focus today on this area of frustration, and we want to think about frustration as being due in part to a player's ability level falling below the required challenge level of the game. We can think about this in terms of there being a maximum cognitive load before a player becomes frustrated, and players with lower ability levels may get overloaded at higher challenge levels. This leads us to a concept of cognitive overload. Overloading people with more information than they can process is always a risk. Like a computer, it's possible to overload the RAM with too many simultaneous things. A RAM overload in a computer can lead to system crashes and freezes. Like a computer, your brain can also error out when running out of memory space to action on the new incoming information. Cognitive overload causes people to stop having fun because they can no longer mentally process all the information. Someone experiencing cognitive overload can forget, make poor decisions, become anxious, or burn out on playing the game altogether. An overloaded player has been pushed past their limits and is not a happy or engaged player anymore. On the screen is another diagram, this time taken from Nikki's 2016 post on Quantic Foundry. This graph has strategy on one axis and excitement on the other axis. There's a variety of game names mapped out on these two axes, which I won't read out loud and aren't all that important for the purpose of this talk. What is relevant is that there's areas of this graph divided into sections labeled as easy fun, balanced fun, hard fun, and a gray uninviting area on the top right called cognitive threshold. In the scary gray section labeled cognitive threshold, there's no games showing both extreme values for excitement and strategy at the same time. In this Quantic Foundry report from which the diagram appears is the quote, "There's a cognitive threshold beyond which the game is simply not fun anymore." In this motivational data collected by Quantic Foundry, they found that games on average can have players highly motivated by either the complexity of strategies or motivated by the excitement of fast-paced action. This cognitive threshold model is one that I often use in my work and suggests that successful games can't ask players to make extremely difficult decisions extremely quickly. There's ultimately a trade-off we have to make as developers and as players between the speed and complexity of gameplay because of limitations in human memory and information processing abilities. This is especially going to be true when we're asking players to learn and remember, retain, and action on a ton of information in really complex video games. At this point, for an accessibility talk, it's especially important for me to emphasize how much individual differences matter when we talk about memory abilities and cognitive load. We can't assume every person has the same memory abilities. We know that people with cognitive disabilities especially may have reduced memories as part of their disability. This means they can hit the state of cognitive overload faster than other people with greater memory abilities. We can think about people with cognitive disabilities who may be running below 1 gigabyte of their, RAM, and then another person running with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and their memory abilities are going to drastically differ when they're playing the same video game. There's also lots of other conditions that temporarily reduce memory abilities for anyone, such as being sick, tired, or intoxicated. We should also think about how factors happening around us in our own daily lives can impact our memory abilities and the amount of cognitive load we can handle in our video games. At a certain point, everyone's going to have days where they just can't keep up with the same demanding speeds and the same demanding cognitive load from one day to another. Even when you're playing within a video game, your capabilities may change when you're first learning the game versus when you've been playing for hundreds and hundreds of hours. So we can't think about memory abilities and cognitive load as something fixed within a person at any point in time. And we can't assume everyone has the same cognitive load for being able to play our games. In fact, Quantic Foundry recently released data in early 2024 that suggested the appeal of strategy as a motivation has substantially declined over the past 9 or 10 years. So the data contributing to the cognitive threshold model I presented earlier is changing around us and might not be a stable characteristic we can count on always being the same. This reduced strategy motivation finding isn't related to factors like age or location. Overall, this data suggests that players today are less frequently saying they're motivated by long-term thinking, planning, and careful decision-making in their video game play. If this is true, the risk of cognitive overload may be higher today among players than it was a decade ago. Regardless of the reason, we as developers need to be sensitive to the fact that some portion of our potential player base may be too overall and worn out and tired during video game play, or just less motivated by having to figure things out on their own, making this risk of cognitive overload as something that might be a more serious conversation, especially for games that look to be really complex and fast-paced. In this next section of the talk, I'm moving into some concrete examples of cognitive overload risks and what we as developers can consider related to those risks. The most obvious part of the game where cognitive overload risks are the highest is in onboarding in the game's opening hours. During onboarding, the more complex the information is, the higher cognitive load that the mechanic is to learn. This leads it to become more difficult to learn and remember more complex information. It might be that the concept of jumping is relatively easy to learn in the game, but some melee punch combo system is really more difficult to learn in the game. In addition, failing to learn one mechanic in onboarding has a risk of impacting players' cognitive resources when learning later mechanics. For example, if players are struggling to swap weapons, it might impact their ability to know how to use those weapons. If players stop using a mechanic after being introduced to subsequent mechanics, it is likely that they haven't had enough practice or time for mastering those abilities. For example, if people stop using a fire ability after being recently introduced to a water ability, it could be an indication that the player's limited memory and abilities simply forgot about one of the abilities that they should be using. So what are some options we can use to consider smoothing out onboarding and thinking about cognitive load in these early hours of the game? Well, first, we can consider developing opportunities for people to practice multiple times before something new is introduced. It might improve your game to move entire mechanics later in the game if too many things are being introduced in the opening minutes of the game. We can also consider hints and reminders to reinforce previously learned mechanics at points where players might show a drop-off in remembering those mechanics. For example, if we see a drop-off in use for a core input from the game, In our game telemetry, that's a great place to put in a booster reminder about the input and the importance of using it. We can consider allowing for on-demand flexibility in revisiting tutorials and game systems information. Since some players need more supports than others, allowing for flexibility and giving some players more time and opportunities to learn may support their journey to having more confidence when they're playing. Cognitive load can also still be a risk many hours into playing a game. Since games often get more difficult as time progresses, there are risks that pop up from time to time in later gameplay. For example, there's a risk of introducing multiple mechanics at the same time that could overload players later in the game. For example, boss fights tend to be an area where a boss might have multiple new abilities players haven't seen before but are expected to learn and react to. Difficulty spikes seen in later gameplay could be due in part to overload from players not being able to make complex decisions fast enough. Maybe the most hardcore of players at the highest ability level are keeping up, but maybe some players are getting left behind and churning as a result of being overloaded with too many things all at the same time. Players may also have difficulty with learning and using the full set of inputs and controls that might be exposed later in gameplay when the difficulty is demanding more of the player than they can keep up with over time. So how do we address these later game risks? We can consider allowing players to individually learn and practice skills that will later be combined in situations like boss fights. For example, enemies leading up to the boss in a dungeon can seed individual mechanics that will later become combined in the boss fight or other endgame climactic peak. We can consider allowing players to adjust either the total number of mechanics they're reacting to or the speed of gameplay. Thinking of endgame bosses in games, it's often possible to change how hard the boss hits you, but not the number of abilities the boss is using or the speed at which that gameplay reactions are happening. So I know players who've had to, quit more challenging combat just because there's too many things that they have to react to too quickly and they can't keep up with that speed of having to make complex decisions. When we think about the challenge of cognitive load, there's other tuning points to consider or accommodate a wide range of ability level in terms of the cognitive load of the gameplay, not just how hard enemies hit you. We can also consider allowing players options to reduce the complexity and the number of controls needed for playing the game. Maybe some games where the intended number and complexity of controls themselves are a barrier for players with cognitive disabilities. So how many people can remember a list of 50 different combos they could do and when to use them? Some players may love that, but other players may need simplified options to help support them at their current level of capability across the game. So maybe instead of 50 combos, they get to cut that list down to 10, or maybe the game chooses the combos for them, or there's some other way of reducing the number of inputs and combos and complexity of that gameplay so that we're looking at allowing players to play their way with the cognitive abilities that they have. This last area I want to touch on relates to players who take breaks and return to games. We know that players who take breaks from a game will forget information. Players with cognitive disabilities may be at increased risk of forgetting information as they play. We can't assume that players can be exposed to information once and that they'll remember it until the end of time. We know from tons of research that memories are fragile and forgetting is always a risk. Overall, for any reason, forgetting can cause frustration if we as developers don't support players with a wide range of cognitive abilities. To combat forgetting, consider supporting reminders and the ability to relearn forgotten information, especially if you expect people to be able to come back to your game after taking a break. There are lots of other considerations, and I'd recommend watching some other cognitive accessibility talks from current and previous game accessibility conferences. In conclusion, forgetting how to play a game is frustrating, but it doesn't have to be.